Institute fellow working on urban growth, public land, and transportation issues. O'Toole's research on national forest management, culminating in his 1988 book, Reforming the Forest Service, has had a major influence on Forest Service policy and on-the-ground management. His analysis of urban land use and transportation issues, brought together in the 2001 book, The Vanishing Automobile and Other Urban Myths, has influenced decisions in cities across the country. In his book, The Best Laid Plans, O'Toole calls for repealing federal, state, and local planning laws and proposes reforms that can help solve social and environmental problems without heavy-handed government regulation. O'Toole's latest book, American Nightmare, How Government Undermines the Dream of Homeownership. O'Toole is the author of numerous Cato papers. He has also written for Regulation magazine, as well as op-eds and articles for numerous other national journals and newspapers. O'Toole travels extensively and has spoken about free market environmental issues in dozens of cities. An Oregon native, O'Toole was educated in forestry at Oregon State University and in economics at the University of Oregon. Everyone please join me in welcoming Mr. Randy O'Toole.
Thank you. I just wanted to start out by asking where everybody's from. Eric says I'm from some weird place called Oregon. I'm from Oregon. We Oregonians are sensitive about that. Anybody else here from the Pacific Coast? California? Idaho. Well, that's almost the Pacific Coast. Not quite. How about the Atlantic Coast?
North Carolina.
Okay.
I lived in Oregon for 7 years, but I grew up on Long Island in New York.
All right, well, that's close enough. So the rest of you are from an interior state. See, the reason why that's important is because I'm going to be talking about land use regulation and housing markets. And in much of the world, the entire countries have decided to regulate their land use and their housing markets. And that regulation has done a lot of harm to their economies. In the United States, we've decided to leave that kind of regulation to the states, and the states that have done it have been mostly coastal states. Not necessarily North Carolina, but New England states, New York, New Jersey, Virginia and Maryland, and the Pacific Coast states especially have done a lot of regulation. So the red states on here, they're the least affordable states. The green states are the most affordable states. And so if you're from a green state and you plan to live in a green state, a lot of what I say is not going to be as interesting to you, except for to make sure that your state never becomes a red state. If you're thinking of getting a job in a red state, you're going to have to think about what kind of pay premium am I going to have to earn to be able to afford to live in that state, especially California and Hawaii, but to a large degree, Oregon, Washington, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York as well. The red states are very unaffordable, and like I say, it's really doing a lot of harm to their economies. I also want to talk about race, and I'll show you why this is important in a little bit. But I asked a question in the title of this talk: why is San Francisco the most racist country, the most racist urban area in America? And I decided to measure racism by how people actually behave. Economists have what they talk about, what they call revealed preferences, revealed behavior. And so we think of places like Ferguson as being racist, or Alabama as being racist. But where are minorities, where are blacks moving to, and where are they moving from? Well, it turns out blacks are moving from the San Francisco Bay Area faster than any other place in the country, when measured as a percentage of their black population. Between 2000 and 2010, the population of the Bay Area grew by 10%, but the black population declined by 15%. Numerically, Los Angeles actually lost more blacks, but they started out with more in the first place, so they only lost about 11% of their black population. And then Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, in the south, that we think of as being a racist area, the black populations are actually growing faster than the white populations, indicating that there are economic opportunities for African Americans there that they can't find in places like California. As I'll mention later, Oregon, Hawaii, and other parts of the red states are also losing black populations. And here's the reason: affordability. This is a house I found online for sale here in Hillsdale. It was actually a little more than this, but according to Coldwell Banker, in 2015, a house like this, which was a 4-bedroom, 2-bath, 2,200 square foot home, would have sold for $138,000 in Hillsdale. Whereas in Atlanta, it's a little more expensive, $207,000. In Dallas, $216,000. In Houston, $237,000. It's supposed to say in Houston. But they're a little more expensive, but these are the fastest growing urban areas in the United States. They're growing by a number equal to the entire population of Hillsdale every month. And they have been growing that fast every single month for more than 20 years, almost 30 years now. And despite that, houses are only a little more expensive than they are here in Hillsdale. Whereas my former hometown of Portland, Oregon, $400,000 for that same house. San Jose, $800,000. San Francisco, $1.36 million. And San Francisco isn't even the most expensive place in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's Palo Alto, where this same house would be over $2 million. Here's a house that just sold in San Francisco. It's 1,800 square feet. It's what would be called a tear-down fixer-upper because it's essentially a dump heap. It sold for $1.2 million in San Francisco. So we're used, especially if you live in one of these coastal areas, we're used to thinking of housing as being something that only the middle class can afford, or only the wealthy can afford. It's something that you can't afford if you're poor or working class. And the irony is that wasn't always true. 110 years ago, working class families were actually more likely to own their own home than middle class families. The reason why that was is because a lot of working class families came over here from Europe. Europe was still coming out of the feudalistic era where all the land was owned by the king or all the land was owned by the government. And so it was very hard to own your own home. And they came here from Europe to own a little bit of land, either a farm or a plot of land in a city and get an urban job. And they saw the home that they lived in as an alternative source of income to supplement whatever other income they could get from having somebody go out and work in a factory or having somebody go out and farm the land. So they planted gardens in their yards, they had livestock, they would often build duplexes. And they would live upstairs and then rent out the downstairs. And even if they didn't have a duplex, they would take in boarders. They would have in-home businesses. And all of these things brought in extra income and made it really valuable for working class people to have homes. Because this was stable income, whereas having a farm meant that it depended on whether your crops succeeded, and having a factory job, depending on whether the factory didn't close down. So at that time, about 1890, you could buy a house in Chicago for $500. It says a home for $100, but that's the down payment. If you wanted it hooked up to the sewer system, it might cost $1,000. But if you didn't mind having a privy in the backyard, it's $500 for a house. And houses like this, the person who made these houses, Samuel Gross, built something like 17,000 homes in Chicago, and you can still buy houses today that he built. They're all hooked up to sewer today, that he built 120 years ago. Middle class thoughts about housing were very different. They were not interested in getting a second income from their house. They were interested in providing a stable place for their family. And they were, frankly, prejudiced. They did not want to have people who they did not like, did not feel comfortable with moving in next door. And that might be black people, but they would be just as concerned about Southern European immigrants, Irish immigrants, You know, most Americans who were middle class at that time had been in the United States for generations, and their ancestors came from England. So anybody who came from a country other than England was considered an immigrant and was probably working class. They had different tastes. They had different tastes in music, different tastes in food, different tastes in recreation. They just didn't want to live next door to people like that. So they rented, because if you rent a home, you can easily move if somebody moves in next door that you don't like. And about 1900, they said, well, how can we make home ownership attractive to the middle class? And they came up with the idea of zoning. We will zone neighborhoods that middle class people like to live in now, and we'll keep the middle class by zoning them so that you can't, and the purpose of the zoning was to keep out the working class, but you would zone them, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Some zoning was racist, but the Supreme Court quickly squelched that. They said you can't say no blacks are allowed in your neighborhood, but you can do other things to make the neighborhoods unattractive to the working class. For example, you can make a zone that says no duplexes. Everything has to be single-family homes. So there's no secondary income from renting the downstairs to another family. You can say you can't take in boarders. Everybody in the house has to be members of the same family. You can say no backyard livestock. You can say no in-home businesses. So all of the things that made home ownership attractive to the working class were zoned out of existence by early zoning codes. Zoning was designed by urban planners who were middle class, and it was designed to make neighborhoods attractive to middle class people like those urban planners. Fortunately, in 1913, Henry Ford started making automobiles on a moving assembly line. And that made automobile manufacturers so cheap that he cut the price of his cars, which were already pretty cheap, in half. And in order to keep workers doing the boring work of working on a moving assembly line rather than being a craftsman, you know, carving the wood or whatever needed to be done for the car, his moving assembly lines were boring. In order to keep the workers, he doubled worker pay. That made it possible for the first time for workers to buy the cars that they were building. And pretty soon other industries followed suit. They adopted moving assembly lines, and that meant they paid their workers more, and the workers then could go out and buy a lot more stuff. And interestingly, moving assembly lines required lots of land. Before moving assembly lines, factories were vertical. You would start doing some work on the top level, then you'd move it down in an elevator to the next level and do some more work, and move it down to the next level and do some more work. But moving assembly lines didn't work very well on a vertical basis, so they needed lots of land. So the factories moved out to the suburbs, and what we consider suburban sprawl began when the jobs moved out to the suburbs, and then the people followed. And the people followed because working class people could afford to buy a car. Then they could go out and buy some cheap land that wasn't zoned, because only cities zoned. Counties in most states weren't allowed to zone. So they bought some cheap land, built their house the way they wanted it to, and then they drove to work. That was the beginning of what people call suburban sprawl. Well, actually, suburban sprawl began 100 years before that, but only the wealthy could move out to the suburbs originally until cars became cheap. Trains were too expensive for working class people to ride on. Streetcars were too expensive for most working class people to ride on. So only when working class people started moving to the suburbs did suddenly suburban sprawl become an issue. And that is what led to the kind of zoning that we have today that's made housing unaffordable. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I harp on housing. Home ownership is important by itself. Numerous studies have shown that after you adjust for all other factors, whether somebody owns a home versus rents a home is going to have a significant difference to the outcome of their children in school. Their children will do significantly better if they own their home, particularly if they're middle class or working class. Doesn't mean so much if you're upper class, but if you're middle class or working class, your children are going to do a lot better in a stable own environment. Also, you can start small businesses by using the equity in your home. Most small businesses are started that way. So Apple, Hewlett-Packard, the big companies we think of today, chances are they were started when the business owner got a loan based on the equity in their home. And home ownership is kind of a canary in the coal mine. If it's hard to own a home, it's usually also hard to start businesses. It's usually also hard to run businesses. And getting the permits and everything else you need to be able to start a business is a lot more difficult in places where it's also difficult to own homes. So when I talk about home ownership, I'm also thinking of it as a bellwether for the rest of the economy as well. So suburban sprawl became an issue when working class people could start to afford to move out to the suburbs. There were actually cities in America, like Detroit, where the average working class income was more than 100% of the average middle class income because unions are so strong. And so they were actually moving out into the very same neighborhoods that the middle class was working in. And yet there was still a cultural clash. There were differences in taste in a lot of different things. And you can see that cultural clash today. A middle class person is more likely to drive a Prius or a Volvo or a Subaru. And a working class person is more likely to drive a pickup truck. Middle class people like to listen to the latest rock and roll music or symphonic music or symphonic heavy metal or whatever. And working class people like to listen to country western. Middle class people drink wine, working class people drink beer. Well, maybe that's not so true a stereotype, but the point is there are cultural differences, and yet we had these same people living in the same neighborhoods, and that really bugged people. And so they invented a new kind of way to control urban sprawl, which had the effect, and I would argue that the effect on the part of the people who originally planned this was intentional. It had the effect of forcing working class people out of single family homes and more of them into apartments. Now, what's called growth management planning actually was first pioneered by Queen Elizabeth, who in about 1596 decreed that she drew a line around the city of London and said you can't build outside that line. Of course, eventually they did build outside that line, but by the 1930s there was enough suburban sprawl in London that British urban planners were very upset by it, and their descriptions of the problems made it clear that they were upset by this cultural clash between middle class and working class people. And they decided that the solution was to pen the working class into great new blocks of flats that would be built in the cities, thus leaving the countryside available for the middle class, who of course were the only ones who had the refined taste to be able to appreciate living in the countryside. Those working class people couldn't appreciate it. So in 1947, the British Parliament passed what was called the Town and Country Planning Act, which was named after a book written by one of the urban planners I just quoted. The Town and Country Planning Act drew green belts around all the major cities of the country. And then they said you can't build inside the green belts, and so if you built outside the city, you'd be living a long way away from the city. Meanwhile, inside the city, all the new housing that was built after the war, and they needed a lot of new housing after the war, was high-rise and mid-rise housing, and it turned out to be awful. Just that same thing was true in the United States, but that was all people had for a long time. And these are the green belts around, the original green belts around major cities. When people decided to move beyond the green belts, that was considered unacceptable. So over the years, they added more and more land, or they withdrew more and more land from the possibility of development, thus making the United Kingdom one of the least affordable housing markets in the world. As a country, it might be the least affordable, other than a few island nations or nation states like Singapore and Hong Kong. Just as an example, this is a house. And by house, I mean this black building here. It's 10 feet wide in the front, but it narrows down to 6 feet wide in the back. And so you have these long, narrow rooms. And if you notice, it was about 3 floors tall. And this house in London recently sold for $933,000. Somebody took a former public restroom that was 300 square feet and turned it into a house and sold it for about $300,000. Somebody had taken some packing crates and made a beach house and they were able to sell it for $200,000. So housing in London was really expensive, but it turns out we've been doing the same thing to people in the United States as well. It began in Hawaii in what was called the Quiet Revolution, which is a term coined by some attorneys working for environmental protection, or the Council on Environmental Quality. And they wrote this book, The Quiet Revolution in Land Use Control. And it was so quiet, nobody ever heard about the book either. But it started in Hawaii, which in the 1950s, before it became a state, was controlled basically by 6 families. 5 families owned all the land, and then 1 family did the construction work. And those 6 families ran the island like their little fiefdoms. And it was almost impossible to buy land because so little land was private other than the land owned by these 5 families. So the 5 families and the construction company were all Republicans, and year after year they elected Republicans in the legislature. And in the mid-1950s, the Democrats took over. They had enough people living there who weren't a member of these 5 families that they had a platform of land reform. They were going to take land away from these 5 families and sell it to other people so that everybody could own their own home. So they swept the State House, they swept the governor's office. Since then, the Democrats have controlled the state completely. And the first thing they did was not land reform, but they passed a law which essentially mandated that forbade you from developing rural areas at all. And then, if you wanted to develop a rural area, what you had to do is get a powerful Democrat to be your business partner, and then you could do it. So it all became about power, only instead of the 5 families holding the power, it was members of the legislature who held the power. And what they ended up doing is they passed a law in 1961 that divided the state into urban and rural land. And they said you cannot build in the rural areas because those areas are farmland, and we don't want to threaten our agriculture. They made housing so unaffordable that they destroyed their farming system because farmers could no longer afford to hire anybody to work on their farm and pay them enough to house them in housing that was totally unaffordable. And so the pineapple and other crops, sugarcane and other crops that were being grown in Hawaii are now being grown in Fiji and other South Pacific islands that have not adopted these kinds of policies. So in 1969, I showed you a map before showing affordable housing prices. In 1969, every place was affordable except Hawaii, which you can barely see this light here, but Hawaii is just beginning to be unaffordable with housing prices a little more than 3 times median family incomes. The standard measure of affordability is you divide median housing prices by median family incomes, and normally in an unfettered market the result is around 2. In other words, you should be able to afford to buy a house that costs about twice your income, and it should be a pretty good house. If it gets up to 3 or more, it's starting to become unaffordable. If it gets up to 4 or more, it's really unaffordable. And in Hawaii, it was just starting to be above 3 in 1969. Today, it's almost 10 times median family income, so it's totally unaffordable. Just to what that means, if you got a loan and paid for it out of 25% of your income, you can buy a house that costs twice your income and pay it off in about 10 years. If you get a loan and the house costs 10 times your family income, you can get an intergenerational loan and never be able to pay it off. You cannot pay enough money to pay it off. So here's housing affordability by market. You can see Houston was still a little more affordable than San Francisco and Los Angeles, but both San Francisco and Los Angeles are about 2 times family income, so pretty much housing is affordable everywhere in the country. Honolulu, if it were on this chart, would be just over 3. So a little bit unaffordable, but not really too unaffordable. That was 1969, and then California had some controversies in the 1960s. California is, of course, a big state. What is it, the third largest state in land area in the country. It has the first most number of people. It's got about 35 million people, but it's got a lot of land. San Jose, the city manager of San Jose decided that he wanted to make San Jose the biggest city in the San Francisco Bay Area. In 1950, it was a tiny little town. Well, you know, it was like Fremont or Dublin. It was a totally unimportant town. He wanted to make it the biggest city, so he started annexing like crazy. He annexed everything he could, and he didn't care if it was connected to San Jose. He'd annex something that was miles away from San Jose. He'd annex something that was connected only by one street to San Jose. He'd annex things that leave unannexed land in the middle that didn't want to be annexed. He'd just annex anything he could. And other cities complained because they said, he's annexing land that really should belong to us, so we should be able to annex. So in 1961, I believe, maybe it was 63, the California legislature passed a law to administer annexations. And it created for every county in the state what was called a Local Area Formation Commission, or a LAFCO. And this commission had to approve all annexations, all incorporations of new cities, and all incorporations of special service districts, like water districts or sewer districts, that developers often created. They didn't incorporate a city. They would take some land and create a sewer and a water district and provide the infrastructure through that district, and then the people who bought homes from them would end up paying for the district over time. But after this law, the local area formation commissions had to approve all of these. Well, who were the local area formation commissions? They were representatives of each of the cities in each county. So San Jose County is in, or the city of San Jose is in Santa Clara County. And there's about 8 cities there. In each city, 2 of their city commissioners were on the Local Area Formation Commission, and they got to vote on what happened outside of their city boundaries. Well, very quickly they realized if they just denied everything that happened outside their city boundaries, all new development would have to take place in their cities, and they'd be able to tax it. Whereas if they let something happen outside their city boundaries, like a new city or a new municipal utility district, somebody else would get those taxes. So they just started saying no. And then in 1970, the state legislature passed the California Environmental Quality Act, which said any major action that could affect the human environment had to have an environmental impact report. And the courts decided that if ever you expanded the boundary of where you would allow new development, like a new annexation or a new municipal utility district, that would require an environmental impact report, and these reports quickly became very expensive. Like, it cost $20 million at least to write one today. The cities weren't about to pay for those reports. So if you were a private developer and you wanted to develop outside the city, you first had to spend $20 million on the environmental impact report, and you second had to convince the city councils, not just the nearest city council, but all the city councils in your county to go along with it. And of course, that would never happen. And so you ended up with every city, this is San Jose, every city having an urban growth boundary around the city, and nothing could happen outside the boundary. And over the next couple of decades, with all new development happening in the cities, the population density of those cities rapidly grew. Today, California has the densest urban populations of any state in the country. 95% of Californians have to live inside of an urban growth boundary because it's almost impossible to put a house outside the boundary. And the urban growth boundaries cover just 5.3% of the state. This is the urban growth boundary for San Jose. They say, well, we can't build out there, it's too hilly. Apparently, they've never been to a little town north of them that is fairly hilly called San Francisco, and it has lots of buildings on it. So 95% live in 5%, and it's very expensive. And since the cities know that you can't go anywhere except in the cities, they will delay you, they will charge you all kinds of fees. You know, it can easily cost $50,000 in service charges just to build one house. And Scott Adams wanted to build a house, the creator of Dilbert. It took him 4 years just to get a permit to build. And then after he got it built, they wouldn't let him move in because they said, well, it's going to take us a while for us to give you an occupancy permit. So all kinds of